Hello, everyone. Good evening. Good afternoon.
Hello, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. So I'd like to welcome you to the second lecture of the Coloniality Now online lecture series on interdisciplinary perspectives on coloniality and decoloniality. Today, Professor Manuela Boatcă will deliver a lecture on Creolizing the nation-state norm, lessons from two peripheries, so the Caribbean in the Americas and Transylvania in the European East. Um, Manuela Boatcă is professor of sociology and head of the Global Studies program at the University of Freiburg, Germany. She has published widely on world systems analysis, decolonial perspectives on global inequalities, gender and citizenship in modernity and coloniality, and the geopolitics of knowledge in Eastern Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Um, Her article, Thinking Europe Otherwise, Lessons from the Caribbean, published in Current Sociology, has been selected by the journal The Sociological Review as one of the best essays of 2021. The same article is featured in the recently published anniversary issue of Current Sociology as one of the most important essays published in the journal's 70 years of existence. And the book Creolizing the Modern, Transylvania Across Empires, published by Cornell University Press in 2022, that she co-authored with Anca Parvulescu, was awarded by the American Sociological Association with the Barrington Moore Prize of the Comparative and Historical Sociology section and an honorable mention of the Emmanuel Wallerstein Memorial Book Award of the Political Economy of the World System section, and more awards are already there. So I'll just stop here, Manuela. And Manuela has held numerous visiting professorships at various universities around the world. Just to name the most recent one, at Södertörn University in Stockholm, so which is coming. The Swedish Research Council has awarded Manuela the prestigious Karsten Hesselgren Visiting Professorship for the summer semester 2025. So difficult to shortly introduce such a productive and successful scholar and colleague. But now I'd like to invite you, Manuela, to deliver the lecture, please.
Thank you very much, Edmund. Thank you, everyone, for attending. It's great to have the possibility to discuss research, not only when leaving the place of work and presenting somewhere else, but presenting more or less at home and still in a virtual space. So I'm happy to see so many familiar names. I don't see any faces. I'll share my screen and hope to engage in a conversation with you in the next hour. So the title of my talk is Creolizing the Nation-State Norm, Lessons from Two Peripheries, bridging some of the work that Edmund mentioned, the book Creolizing the Modern, with a couple of other interests. First, the one in the Caribbean and the non-sovereign territories there, and with the case of Transylvania that we examine in the book, which is a sort of parallel that is not only usually not drawn, but considered completely nonsensical to even draw, because it brings together regions and territories that are kind of very disparate and very kind of not only geographically distant, but methodologically, historically distinct. So what's the benefit of talking about two such very disparate cases, the Caribbean and Transylvania? I'm going to start with my inspiration for a lot of methodological challenges or methodological adventures, and that is world systems analysis take of what it is that we should examine as a rule. And interestingly, in 1984, at the German Sociological Congress in Dortmund, Immanuel Wallerstein gave a keynote speech in which he observed that the title of the Congress, which was Sociology and Social Development, included what he called two of the most common, most ambiguous, and most deceptive words in the sociological lexicon, society and development. And he wanted to point out that the word society always, although not always explicitly, conflates the unit of analysis of the social and society with the nation state. And when this talk that he gave in Dortmund in 1984 was republished in the volume The Essential Wallerstein, he prefaced it by insisting that there is no point in discussing anomalies of social development and insisting on their status as anomalies if we do not understand how they function as rules as well. He prefaced it with one example, given that he was giving this talk in Germany, of saying, does it make sense to discuss Germany as an example of a nation state, given that, again, we're 1984, we have two states that claim the name Germany right now. And at not so long ago, a moment in history, we had three states, when that included Austria, that were under the name Germany. So we have obviously not only somewhere in a very absurd context, nations with more than one state, right here in the place where we're discussing this theme of society and development. At the other extreme, he said, are in the sense of not conflating nations with the state and the state society. Examples such as Puerto Rico, which is a nation without a state. It had never had its own state throughout its history. It has always been colonized, claimed under different names by different colonial powers, and is as such another type of anomaly, another type of exception to the trajectory that has been seen as the normal trajectory in modernity, leaving empire, becoming gradually a nation state, and thus claiming a modern status, so becoming a modern nation state. He used what he called a shocking comparison of a core nation, Germany, and a peripheral nation that did not correspond to one state in order to denounce the fact that being the nation state, becoming a nation state necessarily, was the norm for everyone, and such should be a universal occurrence. So whoever had not made it to nation state status was doing something wrong. And he insisted then instead that, oops, now it's not moving. Okay. That the critique of methodological nationalism that had was yet to be formulated should be kind of accompanied by a critique of methodological universalism, the idea that the nation state is the norm for every state formation. Now, there has been a lot of critique from not only sociologists, but historians and legal scholars also about how what we tend to consider modern nation states in recent history, and Western European nation states at that, have for the most part been imperial states and not nation states. And this was something that historians such as Frederick Cooper were discussing quite a long time ago, but also literary scholars such as Laura Doyle were proposing something similar. Still, we get a textbook narrative about how sovereign nation states emerge in a Europe post the Treaty of Westphalia, so post 1648. And this is still the prevalent or the dominant kind of narrative. And Frederick Cooper was complaining with respect to this dominant narrative that this is an obsession with the nation state, seen as the inevitable outcome of a movement from empire to nation, and as a political form characteristic of the modern era. What that tells us is that there's an implicit teleology. There's no other way in order to become modern as a state formation than to claim nation statehood, and that any sort of multinational, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual empire is something that was there in the past, was definitely there in the past of Western European states, but this has been overcome by a relatively homogeneous form of a state, and that is a state that corresponds mostly with a nation. What Wallerstein was aiming at with his shocking comparison of Germany and Puerto Rico, and what I want to do in the following is argue instead that we should focus on the structural relationship between the cases that are viewed as abnormal or as exceptions in order to rethink and subsequently creolize, and I'm going to say in a minute what I mean by that, the very norm of the modern sovereign nation state. So we'll need to look at the abnormal in order to understand the norm, and that will hopefully make a little more sense. Now, we could phrase it in a way that I will dumb down a little bit to make it more attractive to engage with. Is an exception to the modern nation state norm, such as Puerto Rico, or Germany's 2 or 3 states. Is it a bug in a system, or is it a feature? So Wallerstein said it much more elegantly. He said, when a deduced norm turns out not to be the statistical norm, that is, when the situation abounds with exceptions, anomalies, residues, then we ought to wonder whether the definition of the norm serves any useful function. So from that perspective, a definition that produces lots of exceptions, lots of anomalies, is better regarded as a set of not exceptions to be explained away, but patterns to be analyzed. So if we have too many exceptions to modern nation statehood in different forms, rather states without a nation and nations with more than one state, maybe it is the norm that we should be rethinking and not trying to fit these exceptions into the rule or declaring them abnormal. Now, what does it mean that we should creolize the nation-state norm? We have little space and time to discuss this in detail, and it's a huge theoretical concept, but I'm going to try to explain it briefly. Creolization has been coined in the context of the Caribbean in order to describe processes of racial, cultural, and linguistic mixing, and has been as such for a long time referred to in the context of new languages, Creole languages emerging from a mixture of the language of enslaved people in the Caribbean and the language of the colonizers, or the language of the plantation owners. Now, for the social sciences and going beyond the linguistic realm, it has been increasingly defined, however, as a mode of transformation, and primarily people like Stuart Hall have been responsible for detailing this definition and extending it to a social scientific understanding, a mode of transformation based on primarily unequal power relations that characterize modernity and coloniality, and such unequal power relations as characterize the Caribbean in the context of the plantation economy. So starting with dispossession, colonization, enslavement, genocide, and the plantation economy as its kind of larger framework. Now, when applied to creolizing notions or creolizing theory, creolization has been used by several authors by now as meaning to rethink, to reframe, or to recompose the received categories that structure the social sciences, but also the humanities. And for sociology, we could say creolizing the notion of Europe, creolizing the notion of nation state, what I'm trying to do here, or creolizing the modern, what we have tried to do in the book. Now, what that would mean directly, several authors have expounded or explained that in book-length analyses or edited volumes. My colleagues Encarnacion Gutierrez Rodriguez and Shirley Tate in Creolizing Europe, Françoise Lyonnais and Xu Meishu in the Creolization of Theory, and this is our own Creolizing the Modern. So you see, this endeavor is part of a larger project that is not necessarily looking at the same dimension. So the Creolizing Europe volume looks primarily at migration. The Creolizing Theory looks at concepts in the humanities and social sciences. We are looking at the notion of modernity and modernism. But basically, what they all have in common is an attempt to reinscribe the experiences of the people in regions that have been racialized as non-European, non-Western, and non-white into social theory, because these experiences have tended not to feature or not to feature dominantly in social theory. That has been kind of more generalized from the experience of white Western European Christian authors, populations, and elites. So reinscribing what has not been inscribed into social theory from a position of having been oppressed, but also, especially for our project on Transylvania, to reinscribe rural and peripheral histories into the understanding of the modern. Normally, the modern is associated with the urban, not the rural. And of becoming of modernity. So it's important to have the periphery and not only the metropole. It's important to have the rural, not only the urban. Otherwise, we do not understand how they relate to each other. And part of that, for us, for my co-author, Anka Podwulescu and I, it was especially important to reframe so-called traditional European empires as integral to modernity, coloniality, inter-imperiality, meaning that we have tended to get through this narrative of the modern nation state also a history that includes traditional empires being left behind. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so the Habsburg Empire, then Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, as traditional European empires that, however, were pre-modern. So they were there before modernity, and then modernity comes, and then you have nation states, because they are not modern empires. So empire disappears, modern nation states replace them. Now, if the modern nation state is not the norm, how does that muddle this definition, and what does it do with it, and what do we do with it? Françoise Lyonnais and Xu Meishu have discussed this in their book, The Creolization of Theory, under the title of The Becoming Theory of the Minor. They said, if we look at not the big picture, not the always dominant stories, not the centers and the metropoles, but look at peripheral or subaltern formations, we see the world a little bit differently. Similar to how Quijano and Mignolo proposed to think from coloniality, so from the underside of modernity, and similar to how others talked about thinking from inter-imperiality, is what Xu Meishu and Lyonnais propose as thinking through minor formations. And they're saying if minor formations, and I'm going to explain in a minute what that is, become method and theory, then new analytics will be brought to the foreground to creolize the universalisms we live with today, doing so from the bottom up and from the inside out. It is this process of becoming theory of the minor that we are also calling creolization. Okay, this was the big theory part, and we're done with that now. There remains to explain what that all means. What are minor formations? What do they creolize? Minor formations in the context of discussing state formations are, for instance, those that are depicted in a map such as the one of overseas countries and territories and outermost regions of the European Union and the US. And this is a map that is accurate for the year 2020, so before Brexit, because it includes the EU with 28 member states, so it includes Great Britain. And all the territories depicted in blue are territories that are outermost regions or the EU itself. of the European Union. The territories that are depicted in yellow are so-called overseas countries and territories. They are associated with the European Union, but are not themselves part of the common market and do not have the euro as a currency and so on. Now, the fact that you would think that colonialism is over, there are no colonized territories, or they are exceptions today, there are anomalies, there are residues, and they will gradually be integrated into nation states, is kind of belied by a map such as this, which shows that there's quite a lot of work to be done if we want to achieve that state. So I have elsewhere discussed this situation in which many of the so-called modern European nation states are actually still very much imperial formations because they claim territories in the Caribbean, in the Pacific Ocean, in the Indian Ocean. I've described this as coloniality of memory. And specifically with respect to the Caribbean, I've discussed it as the systematic omission of the colonial ties that still bind European states with colonized territories today from any public discourse on Europe. You don't hear that very much, that France claims territories in the Caribbean. You see that on the weather map when the weather forecast is announced in France, because there's also the weather forecast for Guadeloupe and Martinique and Réunion. But you don't hear it claimed in the sense that France is not a nation state and is an empire state, for instance, or that Britain is. Coloniality of memory also means the systematic avoidance of any overarching classification of current colonial territories as regions of Europe. We speak about Western Europe and Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, especially when there's a crisis, and then there's specific attention also directed to Southern Europe. Or when there are migrants arriving through the Mediterranean to Southern Europe, we don't have a word to refer to European territories claimed by European states that are outside of Europe, for instance, in the Caribbean or in the Indian Ocean. What we do have are references to them that link them to the nation states that claim them. So there are both official and less official designations, such as the Dutch Caribbean, the British West Indies, the French Antilles. So there's no understanding of how these territories are European, but there's very much an understanding of how they are linked to nation states that are supposed to be modern nation states and not empires. So as regards the Caribbean, this is one map that is characteristically transparent about it, in that it lists the country that claims every territory within the Caribbean, which is the region in the world that concentrates the highest number of still colonized territories today, that are, however, not called colonies anymore, but have very different names, although many of them have never changed hands from their initial colonial master. So if we try to give a name to a region in or with respect to the fact that it has an identity as being claimed and as being the responsibility of the European states that claim it, we could refer to it as Caribbean Europe, both in the terms of the outermost regions, such as Martinique and Guadeloupe, or the overseas countries and territories that are both the French and the Dutch and the British territories there. This is an entire discussion kind of basically leading away from the notion that Puerto Rico is an exception, that Wallerstein happened to pick out in order to irritate the audience of the German Sociological Congress. There's an abundance of such exceptions, leading back to his observation, well, is it a bug or is it a feature? Is it now the rule that is wrong? Or is the fact that we have so many exceptions leading us to rethink the very rule or the very definition of it? And here comes the crux, and I know that the time is short, So I'm switching with this to the second and last example, where people like Laura Doyle, who's a literary scholar, comes in to say, well, yes, coloniality, post-coloniality is an important part of the discussion, but we also have something that we should discuss as inter-imperiality, the effects of European empires on European territories, continental European territories today, that we tend to overlook because we continue to make the Eurocentric assumption that Western European imperialism accounts for all recent imperialism. So either a territory has been colonized by Europe and is now independent or is not, or has never been colonized. But we still have the control and the effects of that control of imperial formations in Europe and the effects of that. How does that feature in a discussion of coloniality that is focused on Europe's Western colonial expansion? What happened to the east of that colonial expansion, basically? So this is a shift in attention that we were also very interested in our book, Creolizing the Modern, when we looked at Transylvania. And very briefly, in order to give you a visual of where Transylvania is located, you can maybe the one thing that you easily recognize is the Black Sea over there in the south east. Transylvania is usually only discussed as a historical province of today's Romania. And as such, it is a historical province through the lens of the fact that it was eventually incorporated into what is today the nation-state of Romania, to which also the regions here labeled Wallachia and Moldavia historically belonged. Only that Transylvania was claimed by the Ottoman Empire, belonged to the Habsburg Empire, belonged to Austria-Hungary, was reincorporated into Romania, was claimed by Hungary. And in its entire history, not only from 1699, which is what the map depicts here, but in its entire history, starting from the 13th, 14th century, has only been independent for 1 month. This was November 1918, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated and Transylvania became independent. But then on December 1st, there was a national assembly that voted for annexing Transylvania to Romania. So in a nation, in a dominant kind of textbook narrative of what Transylvania is, it would be either a province of a pre-modern traditional European empire, or it would be a historical province of the nation state that is Romania. Only that its ethnic, cultural, and religious makeup does not make any sense if we understand it as part of Austria-Hungary, or if we understand it as part of Romania alone. And we do not see how all of these imperial interests between and among which Transylvania's status and territory was being negotiated have shaped its historical and present reality. So very quickly okay, I'll skip that. As a last point, and this is going to be the cover of the German translation of our book. We were trying to have this for the English original as well. This is a map of the ethnic groups of Austria-Hungary in 1910. And you see in the southeast, Transylvania, as part of Austria-Hungary. The map was done by a census, so by asking people to identify with an ethnic group with respect to their language of use, not necessarily their mother tongue, but the language of use, so the one they used every day. And Transylvania is depicted there as including Romanians, dominantly in orange, Germans, quite significant pockets, Hungarians, a hugely significant pocket, but not only. Then also some Czechs, and missing from this particular map, but very much present in history and present of Transylvania are both the Jews and the Roma that are very much part of that ethnic and religious makeup, but were not included as such in the census. So if you look at, and Armenians in a smaller number. Now, through this kind of understanding, we will see how a territory such as Transylvania, that is then defined as something that was part of an empire, but then became part of a nation state successfully. So it was successfully homogenized, only becomes modern through being seen as losing all of that diversity, as kind of evening out all of the multicultural, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, which, if it still lingers, it is considered a source of conflict. So this multi-ethnic territory is a kind of powder keg. There's always conflict coming out of that. This is what is usually the depiction of territories that are under the banner of a nation state, but include more than one ethnic group, and that conflicts arise from that. The claim here is that modernity does not arise from the homogenization and the linear development towards one modern nation state that engulfs such regions, but that just as we do with state formations that are still colonized today, that do not conform to the idea of a modern, independent, sovereign nation state, we should look at regions that were never independent, that probably will never achieve or are not even striving for independence, but whose ethnic, cultural, and religious makeup is a result and is given by imperial negotiations and interactions. So this is what makes them modern, which is just as modern as the emergence of nation statehood, just as modern as being colonized in the 21st century. So all of these are patterns to be analyzed in a world system that is modern, not because it only consists of nation states, but because it consists of a variety of state formations that we should not be excusing as, well, Transylvania was not meant to become a state, so it didn't, and is now a proper Romanian state. We do not understand anything if we reduce it to that. So basically, this is a plea for a comparison that is relational out of the conditions that have shaped regions and not out of a methodological universalism that departs from the idea that everyone should become the same kind of state formation in order to be considered modern. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Manuela, for this wonderful, eye-opening and thought-provoking lecture.